What's poppin', jumpers? It is me, MT, and welcome back to the Heavy Spoiler Show, y'all. This is about to be a breakdown for the 2008 movie Jumper, one of the most underrated superhero movies of that era. Listen, I know the acting isn't all that great, but Jumper 2008 has a special place in my heart because it stars Anakin Skywalker and the super attractive Rachel Bilson. She was so cute, oh my god. So without further ado, let's jump on into this thing, shall we? Jumper is a 2008 film directed by filmmaker Doug Liman and was loosely based on a popular novel of the same name written by Stephen Gould in 1992, the year that I was born. A great year. And when I say loosely, I mean very loosely. Liman basically took the premise of a teleporting boy on the run, along with a few names of the characters from the book, and straight up made his own story with the hopes of capturing the same atmosphere of the original source material. The main elements that Liman took from the book for the movie are the names David and Millie, and David teleporting away from his abusive father to go live by himself and rob a bunch of banks. Everything else, though, Liman decided to go rogue and invent himself, much like he did when he adapted 2002's The Bourne Identity, which was based on the 1980 novel, and 2014's Edge of Tomorrow, which was loosely based on the Japanese novel All You Need Is Kill from 2004.
When you take a book and turn it into a movie, I'm really someone who believes in throwing the whole thing out and reinventing it as a movie. We preserved, a scene from the first act, and that's basically it in terms of what we were preserving from the book. But this is 100% Stephen Gould's story. It's just reinvented as a movie.
Unfortunately, Doug Liman's reinvention of the Jumper mythos did not exactly land well with the general audience, as the movie was met with mostly negative reviews when it first came out, with one of the main complaints being that the movie's story deviated too damn much from the source material. But I, for one, was not one of those complainers, okay? When I saw this movie when I was a teenager in 2008, I freaking love this thing, man. And no, I am not just saying that because Rachel Bilson is fine as hell, okay? I genuinely enjoyed this universe that Doug Liman was clearly intending to expound upon in future movies, and I appreciated it for the start of the potential franchise that it was. I mean, this was the period before the rise of the MCU, so whether it was Pirates of the Caribbean or the Transformers movies, I was down for any sort of sci-fi franchise building in theaters, man. But unfortunately, despite teasing more for the characters of David and Millie, and the film generating a little bit over $80 million in the US and Canada, and around $140 million overseas, no direct sequel to Jumper ever materialized on the big screen. A fact that has pissed me the hell off to this day. I mean, yeah, Doug Liman did go on to produce that Impulse TV series for YouTube Premium in 2018 that centered around another female Jumper entirely. Nothing in those 2 seasons of that show really connected to the narrative of Liman's initial take on Jumper at all, despite that show being set in the Jumper universe. Though technically, there have been various spin-offs to Liman's original story, like the video game Jumper Griffin Story, which released on the PS2, Xbox 360, and the Wii 2 days before the movie would drop on Valentine's Day 2008, and there was also a comic book titled Jumper Jump Scars that released a day after the video game. But if you're ever thinking about playing the video game, do yourself a favor and never do that. That game is a hot bag of ass, which is a huge bummer considering that game really does a lot to explain the backstory of Griffin as a character. Because in that game, we literally see both how Griffin's parents are killed and how David's mother was involved in their murder. But anyways, let us get into the actual movie, shall we? Jumper begins with Hayden Christensen standing on top of Egypt's Great Sphinx as he looks over a wide sea of sand. Anakin Skywalker's least favorite thing in the entire galaxy. But while Hayden Christensen did ultimately nab the job, Doug Liman initially wanted the role of David to go to rapper Eminem. But after Liman came across Hayden Christensen, he knew that Hayden was absolutely perfect for his particular vision. Filming for Jumper actually started in May 2006 with completely different actors for both David and Millie. But after about 3 weeks, Doug Liman decided to stop completely to recast the 2 main leads of the movie, as he felt like they weren't exactly right for the role, which then led to both Hayden Christensen and Rachel Bilson being cast in their stead. Jamie Bell was actually part of those initial 3 weeks of shooting as well, but Doug Liman liked him enough to have him stay on for the project. And while working together on this movie, both Hayden Christensen and Rachel Bilson started to become romantically involved and would date each other for a hot decade before they ultimately decided to call their engagement quits in 2017. Hayden and Rachel would be the second long-term relationship that sprung from one of Doug Liman's productions, as the 2005 action spy comedy film Mr. and Mrs. Smith would famously bring Angelina Jolie together with Brad Pitt. But they wouldn't last either. But that's mostly because Brad Pitt is a huge douche to his family, but nobody likes to talk about that for some reason. But anyways, earlier that day, David had coffee in Paris, France, before surfing in the Maldives south of India, then taking a nap on the dormant volcano that is Tanzania's Mount Kilimanjaro, the tallest freestanding mountain above sea level, and then flirted with a Polish woman in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The mention of Paris, France first, though, could subtly foreshadow David's deep affections for his childhood crush Millie, considering that Paris was one of Millie's dream destinations when she was in high school, as we can see Paris written at the top of a list of European cities on a post-it note inside of her locker, with Prague, Czech Republic, Venice, Italy, London, England, and Dublin, Ireland right under it. And in typical high school fashion, Millie actually misspells Prague completely, despite being so obsessed with going. And not far from that is another piece of decor that says "I Heart Paris" on it, right under some pictures of the Eiffel Tower. So basically, future David stole her entire flow, man. But above that post-it note are landmarks of Millie's most beloved city of Rome, Italy, including pictures of the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Piazza Venetia, as well as a Rome-centric post-it note with the names of landmarks on them, with those locations being the Colosseum again, the Fountain of Trevi, St. Peter's Square, and the Sistine Chapel. Young David is played by actor Max Thieriot, who has starred in the CBS drama Fire Country since 2022, and the young Millie is played by actress AnnaSophia Robb, who previously played Violet Beauregard in the 2005 remake of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and would famously crack her head open and die after doing manic pixie dream girl bullshit in a forest in 2007's The Bridge to Terabithia. And knowing Millie's love for Paris, David would go and buy an Eiffel Tower snow globe to gift to her after school. But because Mark, the local school bully, can't get no bitches himself, he would proceed to cockblock the hell out of David by stealing and launching the snow globe onto the surface of a frozen river, leading to David falling into said river after he tries to retrieve it. And it would be David's struggle to survive his perilous situation that would trigger his jumper powers to manifest for the very first time, leading him to accidentally jump to the non-fiction section of the Ann Arbor Regional Library due to his very strong memories of the location. And it's when he first jumps there that we first discover that David Rice grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is very different from the source material, as the original Davy Rice in that book was from Stanville, Ohio. And David's first time jumping was also much different from the original novel written by Stephen Gould, as Davy would jump to the fiction section of the Stanville Public Library for the first time when his abusive drunk of a father was about to beat his ass real bad. So the rules of becoming a jumper in this universe appear to be similar to how the X gene can manifest itself in the Marvel universe for some people, as stress and danger are huge transformative triggers in both these universes apparently. Incredibly wet and cold, David walks back home to his douchebag of a dad, Carl Rice, played by actor Michael Rooker, starring in his first superhero movie of his career before expertly playing Yondu in the Guardians of the Galaxy films. Carl then tries to pick a fight with David as David tries to hide in his room, but the stress of this event would cause David to teleport right on back to the library once again. After questioning if he just teleported, the camera then cuts to a first-person view of David looking over a mess of books that he knocked over. And as the camera pans up, we see a series of words that symbolically point to the overall narrative using some cool cinematography. For example, near the center of the frame at the beginning of this shot, we see the 1992 book What Do I Do Now by Eileen Netchus on top of a book called Hide and Seek. I feel like those two books were placed there by Doug Liman specifically as a way to reflect the thoughts that David is having in this exact moment. Like David's literally asking himself, what do I do now? but we would soon find out that he would answer that question by playing hide and seek with both the police and the Paladins after becoming a bank robber. So these books basically foreshadow what he's going to do. Then, as the camera pans up, we see a poster that says, "Escape to your local library, open a world of wonder," symbolically pointing to how both of David's teleportation trips to the Ann Arbor Regional Library have now opened up access to the entire world for him, finally giving David true freedom from his shitty life. David's desire for freedom is even plastered all over his bedroom walls, which are themed after sailing ships. And when David jumps back to his bedroom, we can see that he has a poster of Metallica's third studio album, Master of Puppets, on one wall, as well as posters of Mark Twain and Kurt Cobain on another, showing David's appreciation for the arts of literature and music. And I also noticed these styrofoam planets of the solar system on David's bed, which fell onto his bed during one of his teleportations. These could have been placed there as a way for Doug Liman to foreshadow his future plans for both David and the Jumper universe if his plans for a trilogy were actually realized. Liman has gone on record in the past to say that the Jumper sequels would have eventually seen David jumping between planets in the cosmos and eventually through time itself, which would have been super dope. So David's teleportation, bringing these planets to his bed, might actually be symbolic to David's jumper powers eventually bringing other planets closer to him as he develops his powers. But anyways, David then resolves to leave his childhood home forever and become a runaway. But before he leaves, he stops by a distraught Millie's house to drop off the snow globe that almost turned his white ass into a riverside popsicle. In Millie's bedroom, we can see photos of the Eiffel Tower on her walls and a globe on her bedside table, more displays of Millie's intense desire to travel. Then after Millie retrieves her snow globe from her swing set, we then see David taking a bus across the George Washington Bridge on his way to New York City, eventually making his way to the Elk Hotel at 360 42nd Street at 9th Avenue. And as David approaches the hotel, Liman has David walk in front of this bus stop advertisement for Visa with a piggy bank on it, subtly hinting towards David robbing banks not long after he checks in. And on the wall of David's shitty hotel room is a framed Bible verse quoting Ephesians 6:10, which states, "Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might." And then around this time, we get the title card of the movie, with this title card being themed after the jump scars that the jumpers of this film leave behind after creating wormholes within the very fabric of reality. David then heads to Central Park the next day to hone his jumping skills before jumping to the top of the Empire State Building by accident after reliving a memory that he had there with his mother, Mary Rice, played by actress Diane Lane, who would later mother another superpowered boy in 2013's Man of Steel and 2016's Batman v Superman. And during this memory, David's mom jokingly tells David that maybe they'll both see King Kong while they're on the Empire State Building, referring to the iconic scene from the original 1933 movie that saw King Kong climbing the building with a terrified white lady in hand. This movie referencing King Kong at all is actually quite funny, considering that Griffin actor Jamie Bell played the character Jimmy in the 2005 King Kong movie. And before the memory ends, Mary holds on to a slightly nervous David and tells him that she's got him and that she's not letting him go, which of course would be a big fat lie in the long term, as her ass would leave him soon after he turned 5 years old. And after his surprise trip to the Empire State Building, David then resolves to rob New York City's Immigrant Savings Bank. And as soon as he walks into the bank lobby, he asks to go to the bathroom. And while this lobby is the actual IRL Immigrant Savings Bank lobby, the downstairs area with the safes in the bathroom was actually shot inside of the basement of the One King West Hotel in Toronto, Canada, as that hotel used to be the Dominion Bank building. Of course, because jumping is limited to places that the jumper is most familiar with, when David jumps back to rob the bank with absolutely zero mask on, he jumps to the bank bathroom first before then jumping to the safe and robbing it blind. David then begins blasting Tick Tick Boom by the Hives when the hotel manager bangs on his door to complain about all that noise. However, when he does, notice that David's door has the number 203 on it, which is different from the 256 that was on the door when David first rented the room. So that's a little bit of a mistake there. Meanwhile, in comes Samuel L. Jackson's Roland Cox to investigate the bank robbery. The interior of the bank looks a lot different than the lobby that we saw earlier because this bank scene was filmed at a completely different bank in a completely different country, the Canada Permanent Trust Building in Toronto to be exact. And when Roland arrives, he flashes a fake NSA badge, a nod to Stephen Gould's original Jumper novel, which saw Davy Rice running from the NSA rather than the cult of paladins that Doug Liman created specifically for his adaptation. And also, Roland's character in the original novel wasn't named Roland Cox at all, but instead Brian Cox. But Doug Liman reportedly wanted the character's name changed to Roland so people would not confuse him with the real-life actor Brian Cox. Not sure how anybody could mix these two up considering Brian Cox looks nothing like a white-haired black man, but hey, do you, Doug? And while Roland grabs records and security tapes from the bank to begin his years-long investigation into David's robbery, we get a transition to David drinking a soda or maybe even a beer on his bed while enjoying the fruits of a job well done. And to the right of his bed, amongst all that cash, we can see another can of soda resting on a solid bar of gold that he yoinked from the heist. And David has apparently gone and stole himself an NYPD police scooter as well and parked it in this tiny ass room. David would of course continue the trend of having motorbikes in his living spaces, as we can see that he owns a Harley Davidson Fat Boy in the following adulthood transition scene. David's fancy New York City apartment is filled with photographs of all of his different jump sites that he's collected over the years. However, in the book, David would actually film all of his jump sites on tape, but Doug Liman figured that an apartment full of photographs would look a lot cooler, and I totally agree. Then, after grabbing a stack of cash from his hidden walled-off room of money and casino chips from around the world, David then jumps to London, England to go hang out on Big Ben before picking up a hot blonde lady at a bar called the Irish Embassy Pub and Grill. However, this Irish Embassy bar is not located in London at all, but is actually a real-life bar in Toronto, Canada. But little does David know that another jumper named Griffin O'Connor heard him jumping about all super loud and whatnot. Griffin is played by actor Jamie Bell, who is known for his award-winning performance in 2000's Billy Elliot, as well as for voicing Tintin in the underrated animated masterpiece of a Tintin movie from 2011, as well as The Thing in 2015's Biggest Mistake, Fantastic Four. And like I mentioned before, Bell is the actor that has been involved with this project the longest, and actually saw at least 12 different versions of the script during his time on set. Director Doug Liman was a big fan of just going with the flow and finding the movie as he went, which meant a constantly changing script. And even though it looks like this is Griffin's first time learning of David's existence, it's actually not. In the Jumper video game Jumper Griffin story, we learn that Roland showed Griffin a picture of David to try to get him to help the Paladins find David, a stupid ass offer that Griffin of course refuses. But it was that day that Griffin learned that the Paladins wanted to find David in particular really badly, which then motivates Griffin into following David in Rome. Because wherever David goes, the Paladins were sure to be close behind. And Griffin sure does love killing him some Paladins, man. But anyways, after David gets himself laid, he decides to go surfing with a gray and blue surfboard. However, after being disappointed by the lack of waves, he would soon jump to Fiji to surf the 30-foot waves there on a surfboard that has magically turned yellow. But don't worry, y'all. When we see David having lunch on the Great Sphinx of Giza in the following scene, his surfboard is magically blue and gray once again. Then the movie shifts to Roland and his squad of paladins hunting down another jumper in a jungle, with this jungle set actually being in High Park in Toronto, Canada. And it's this scene that we get our first look at the jump scar ripping device that Roland would use to track David and Griffin later on in the movie. And as the Paladins put the device away, we can see the words Project 125 written in Japanese on the top of the container. In the Jumper Griffin Story video game, we learn that the Scar Ripper was actually developed in Tokyo, Japan, and was stolen by the Paladins. But anyways, after Roland guts that jumper like a fish, he immediately heads to David's apartment when he gets a lead on his 8-year-old bank robbery case, leading the two to finally meet face to face for the first time since Hayden threw Sam Jackson out of a window in Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And as the two talk, we can see that David has a globe at the center of his living room with various pins in various locations, likely a map of places that he'd like to go in the future. And layered over this bookshelf in the background is a photo collage David made using the outline of the United States. But soon the chatting stops, and Sam Jackson finally gets revenge on Hayden for getting him electrocuted by Palpatine by injecting 1,000 volts of electricity into him this time around. However, after making a quick jump to his hidden room to grab some cash, David is able to escape and jump back to his childhood bedroom in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I did notice that David's bedroom looks completely untouched since he left it 8 years ago, which makes me think that David's father may have actually regretted being a jerk to his son all of those years, because someone who didn't actually care about his son would have thrown all of teenage David's shit away a long time ago. It seems like Carl Rice may have held out hope that his son would return one day. But when Carl tries to extend the invitation to come home to an adult David, David would simply reassure him that he's not crazy before teleporting away. Then David stops by the Ann Arbor water tower to get an overview of his childhood neighborhood. The same water tower that we could see in the distance when a wet David was walking home from school at the beginning of the film. This Ann Arbor water tower is actually the Peterborough water tower in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. And after learning Millie works at a place called Houlihan's Bar, David heads there immediately to stalk the girl he liked 8 years ago in high school like the handsome creep that he is. And like I hinted at before Hayden Christensen and Rachel Bilson were cast, actors Tom Sturridge and Teresa Palmer were initially cast as David and Millie. But after those two actors were let go, Doug Liman reportedly initially offered the role of Millie to actress Evan Rachel Wood, who recently played the character Dolores Abernathy in the HBO series Westworld. But anyways, this scene at Houlihan's Bar was actually filmed at a bar called The Green Room, located at 296 Brunswick Avenue in Toronto. David tries to leave the bar after stalking Millie for a bit before he runs into his favorite childhood bully, Mark Cobalt, played by Teddy Dunn, who previously played the character Duncan Kane in Veronica Mars. Mark mentions the 1999 movie The Sixth Sense when he tells David that he thinks that he's seeing a ghost, and the commotion Mark causes leads Millie to saying hello to David herself. However, a fight would break out between Mark and David after a drunk Mark smacks Millie on the ass. And in the original book, Mark is actually Millie's ex-boyfriend who tries to forcefully dance with Millie at a party, which then leads to Mark getting teleported away by Davy after a brief fight. A moment that Doug Liman recreated in his own way in this scene when David teleports Mark to the Immigrant Savings Bank vault. And after the fight, David gets a scar on the corner of his right eye, the same place where Anakin Skywalker would have a scar in Revenge of the Sith. And after Millie helps dress David's wound, they have a chat at the bar. And while they do, I could not help but notice this woman in the red shirt in the background try her absolute best to not look at the camera, but failing repeatedly and miserably, which I found hilarious. And the director must have noticed her awkward ass too, because that extra is nowhere to be seen after the end of this shot. David then quickly invites Millie to go to Rome with him, and she readily accepts, with the two eventually booking a hotel room at the Boscolo Excedra Roma in Rome, Italy. And after the two enter the bone zone with one another, they decide to have some dinner just outside the Pantheon at a restaurant called Napolitano's Pantheon. Then the two head to the actual Roman Colosseum, the largest amphitheater on the planet. And the film production actually did film in the real-life Colosseum for this scene. But they did have super strict rules. For example, the production was not allowed to bring any of their lighting equipment inside of the Colosseum whatsoever, which is why the Colosseum scenes primarily rely on the sun for lighting. And while they were of course permitted to use cameras, the city of Rome stipulated that none of the cameras used could be touching the ground at any time, forcing the cameramen to capture all of the shots manually. Also, the time frame that Doug Liman and the production had for shooting was pretty damn limited as well, with Italy only giving the Jumper production 4 hours to shoot each day over a course of 3 days. So any shooting that did not get done between the hours of 6:30 and 8:30 a.m. and 3:30 and 5:30 p.m. just did not get done, primarily due to the Colosseum being a hotspot for tourists. So basically, Hayden and Rachel had to be prepared to act in the Colosseum immediately with pretty much no rehearsal at all, because they simply did not have the time for a rehearsal. But anyways, after being told that the Colosseum was closed, David and Millie sneak in anyway. But when David tries to open a door for Millie to get closer to the actual center of the Colosseum, David runs into Griffin, desecrating the Colosseum with his urine. This moment of Griffin peeing in the Colosseum actually got edited out in various television edits of this movie, as that act was seen as highly disrespectful towards all the Christians who died in this very Colosseum. So in those TV edits, David will actually see Griffin sitting on one of those rocks instead of taking a whiz. Griffin then tells David that he's been tracked by the Paladins before Griffin begins fighting the Paladins by himself in an action sequence that was actually filmed inside of a studio recreation of the Colosseum, because, you know, They couldn't do all that fighting in the actual Colosseum. And much like Roland was, the Paladins are each equipped with a Paladin shock rod, which work to ground the jumpers to the earth itself in order to prevent them from jumping.
This is the only thing that could stop a jumper if you get into conflict with a Paladin. As long as they're not kind of holding on to you, you can just jump away. Even if they are, you can take them with you. But this is something that stops you from jumping, because this is basically fired. It catches onto you, and then the base of their baton basically stabs into the ground, so you're grounded, and there's an electric charge which goes through it, which means that no matter what, you can't jump.
But anyways, after Griffin kicks those Paladins' asses, he teleports one of them to his secret lair in the Sahara Desert. David then goes through Griffin's jump scar after him, where David gets a glimpse at Griffin's jump sites that he keeps recorded on DVDs, with Montreal, London, and Tokyo being the most visible. And what I did notice about this moment is how David accurately calls Griffin's jump scar a jump scar, despite never actually hearing the term used by Paladins or Griffin before, which is kinda odd. David then jumps back to the Colosseum before trying to book it the hell out of there before the police can get to him for breaking in and fighting. But unfortunately, David would be promptly arrested by the Roman authorities. But David would absolutely luck the hell out when his mother, Mary, of all people, would appear out of thin air to break David out. However, before David could get a chance to talk to her, she would immediately vanish. Also, fun fact, while the Jumper movie establishes that David's mother left him when he was a child in order to keep the Paladins away from him, in the original book, she would actually end up leaving her family because David's douche of a dad kept beating her up. David then grabs Millie and books it out of the police station. And when we get an exterior shot of the station, we can see St. Angelo's castle in the distance. And fearing for her safety, David then immediately brings Millie to the Leonardo da Vinci International Airport to send her back home without giving her any of the answers that she desperately wanted and deserved. Then David jumps back to Griffin's secret desert lair, where we see Griffin playing Halo and drinking Sierra Mist and Mountain Dew next to a dead Paladin. And while chatting with Griffin, David gets a good look at one of his walls that Griffin has covered with drawings of Roland, even writing the words "destroy him" on one of those pictures. And next to that particular picture, we can also see what looks like Roland getting his stomach torn open by a buzzsaw, which is a pretty gnarly way to go. Griffin then starts going through his pile of PlayStation 2 video games to play next, with 2004's ATV Off-Road Fury 3 being amongst his collection. And I'm not sure why he's looking through a stack of PS2 games, considering that he is clearly using an Xbox here. The production really did not think that one through. But this ATV video game serves as a bit of foreshadowing towards Griffin's overall love of ATVs, as we would see him use an ATV later on in the movie to drive away from Roland. But anyways, Griffin goes on to tell David that the Paladins have been active since the medieval period, cleansing the world of jumpers, even orchestrating the Spanish Inquisition as well as the Salem witch trials, which is super wild. And when Griffin mentions how the Paladins will one day kill everyone David loves, David immediately heads back to his dad's house to check up on him. And when he does, we can see some Paladin equipment left behind outside of the house, including one of their shock rods. But when David heads inside of his dad's house, he would run into even more Griffins, as the Griffins from Family Guy can be seen on the TV as David's father lies motionless on the ground after Roland would pay him a visit the night before. And if you're wondering, the Family Guy episode playing on the TV is actually Season 3, Episode 13's Screwed the Pooch, that released on November 29th, 2001. David then quickly teleports his father to the hospital to get some help, and we pretty much never see him again after this, and we never really learn whether or not he died from his injuries. Emotionally distraught, David then heads to the NYPD 1st Precinct building at 16 Erickson Place, New York, to do his own interrogation on a Mark who recently had a visit with Roland himself, finding out that this douchebag told Roland all about Millie. And seeing that he only has 8 hours left until Millie's flight lands, David feels like he has no choice but to head back to Griffin's lair to propose that they work together to stop Roland. Griffin tries to blow David off completely by jumping to a restaurant in China, where one of the female workers there starts to chew Griffin out for leading her on before he just disappeared. Griffin even apparently promised her that he'd get some sort of tattoo that would make their relationship more serious, but he never actually did that. My dude was just trying to get laid. And while attempting to shake David off of his tail, Griffin then jumps to Tokyo's Ginza station before heading up to the streets of Shibuya. David would then bring up the Marvel team-up comics when attempting to get Griffin to join him in jumping Roland's Dennis Rodman-looking ass. A very fitting reference considering that both Jamie Bell and Samuel L. Jackson both would go on to play Marvel characters in their career. Jamie Bell would of course infamously go on to play the Thing in the 2015 dumpster fire that was Fox's last Fantastic Four movie, and Samuel L. Jackson would debut as Nick Fury only a few short months after the release of Jumper. An actually funny random story, but back in 2008, I actually watched Jumper for the first time right before I went to go see Iron Man in theaters. Like literally, I watched Jumper and then hopped into a car and went to go see Iron Man. So when I heard Samuel L. Jackson's voice in the shadows when he showed up at the end of Iron Man, my brain was like, oh shit, it's Roland! Run for your life, Tony! Get some help! Only to be pleasantly surprised. And speaking of Jamie Bell in the Fantastic Four, he's also no stranger to falling in love with a fellow co-star either, as Jamie would kind of take a cue from Hayden and marry his Fantastic Four co-star Kate Mara in 2017 after they met on the set of that movie. But anyways, Griffin then decides to steal a 2007 Mercedes-Benz SL65 AMG from a Tokyo Mercedes-Benz dealership and then drive it all the way to Tokyo's Rainbow Bridge before Griffin finally agrees to a limited run of a team-up with David. However, when David finds out that Millie's flight arrived earlier than expected and that Roland was hot on her trail, David decides to teleport to Millie's Ann Arbor apartment, an apartment that really is not in Ann Arbor at all, but located at 260 Gamble Avenue in Toronto. David then heads inside and reluctantly shows Millie his jumper powers by jumping to a nearby shelf to hand her the snow globe that he got for her 8 years ago. But since Roland and his religious buddies were charging their way up the stairs, David would make the rash decision to teleport Millie to Griffin's secret lair, not realizing that Roland and the Paladins still have Project 125 available to rip David's jump scar a new one. And when Roland and his team arrive at the lair, David and Griffin go into hiding. And while David is trying to keep out of sight, he spots drawings, photographs, and newspaper articles of his mother on one of Griffin's shelves, with some of these images even having the words death and die bitch written on them. And like I alluded to before, this is because Mary Rice was involved somehow in the murder of Griffin's parents when he was just a small boy. So he desperately wants to kill Mary Rice to avenge them. And like a complete dingus, David would try to get a closer look at these images, which would then cause Roland to tether him up with ease. But then Griffin would save him from getting gutted by Roland by punching him outside of his lair before sending a double-decker bus from London straight at Roland's direction. Eventually, Griffin would end up stealing the Jump Scar Ripper device from the Paladins, stranding Roland and his people at Millie's apartment. However, Roland would still manage to shoot a tether through the Jump Scar and pull Millie right on through it back to her apartment to use as bait for David. However, Griffin, seeing a perfect opportunity to finally kill Roland and a ton of Paladins at once, decides to arm a bomb in his lair meant to blow them all up, including Millie. And when David protests, Griffin says that their Marvel team-up is over, while simultaneously moving some actual Marvel comics around. And one of these Marvel comics that we see has a Christmas-themed X-Men advertisement on it that was found in the pages of 1989's Amazing Spider-Man 327 and Web of Spider-Man 59. And near that comic is a copy of 1983's New Mutants number 6. But anyways, to keep Griffin from killing Millie, David takes the bomb and teleports it to the Roman Colosseum. Griffin chases after him, and the two end up leaving the safe atop one of the pyramids of Egypt before David takes the detonator back to Tokyo's Rainbow Bridge right before the two jump and frolic in Dubai. Then they make their way to Times Square in New York, where we can see The Color Purple is playing on Broadway. And this is before David jumps them both to the top of the Empire State Building and attempts to toss the detonator off of it. However, Griffin would jump off of the building after the detonator, and the two would eventually find themselves in a pool in Tijuana before hitting the Arctic. However, before David could throw the detonator in those frozen waters, Griffin would grab a random pickup truck that says Ramirez and Sons on the side in Spanish and jumps that truck into David, leading the two to land in a war-torn Chechnya, with this war zone actually being a set that they built in Toronto. And when Griffin first teleports this truck to Chechnya, we can see a scared man in the driver's seat. However, as soon as Griffin gets out of the car, this driver is somehow nowhere to be seen, disappearing out of thin air like some sort of jumper himself. which is lucky too because that truck would soon get crushed by a nearby tank. However, despite Griffin grabbing the detonator and seemingly becoming the victor, David would make the high IQ move and trap Griffin within some collapsed power lines before grabbing the detonator and jumping to Millie's. However, David would immediately get caught in Roland's trap, forcing David to turn his jumper powers to 11, much like that shirt that David wore all around Rome with Millie would foreshadow earlier on in the movie, as that shirt is a volume dial getting turned to 11. And to everyone's surprise, including David's, he would manage to jump Millie's entire apartment into the Huron River, the same river that a young David fell into while trying to retrieve that snow globe. And during this underwater sequence, director Doug Liman actually created a mini set at the bottom of a pool and had Hayden and Rachel swim down several feet into that pool with oxygen tanks in order to get the shots of both of them struggling underwater. And of course, for the third time in this movie, David would then jump back to the Ann Arbor Regional Library with both Millie and Roland, and also the remains of Millie's apartment, before finally jumping Roland to the Grand Canyon, right above the Colorado River, instead of just killing him, because apparently not killing him proves that David is not as dangerous and evil as Roland thinks. And finally, the movie ends with David somehow finding out where his mother lives and being greeted to the revelation that he has a half-sister named Sophie Drake, played by Kristen Stewart. Stewart's inclusion in Jumper would mark the second time that both her and high school David actor Max Thoreau would work together on a project since they did 2004's Catch That Kid. David's mother tells David that while she loves and cares for him, she had to leave him when he would accidentally make his first jump at the age of 5, because if she didn't, she would be forced to kill him. Mary then gives David a hug and tells him that she's going to give him a head start before she and the Paladins would ultimately be forced to hunt him down. But we of course would never get to see this happen, as Jumper would never actually end up getting a sequel, which is a damn shame because I really would have loved to see the narrative get super cosmic and timey-wimey just like Doug Liman always planned. But honestly, I'm just glad that we got what we got because Jumper is honestly one of my favorite movies ever and a true underrated classic. Yeah, it might be a guilty pleasure, but you know what? I'm cool with that. But that is it for this breakdown for the 2008 movie Jumper. What did you guys think about this movie? Let us know in the comment section down below. You guys can follow me at Mastertainment on Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, YouTube, wherever I am on the internet. But most importantly, follow Heavy Spoilers here on YouTube by hitting that subscribe button and maybe hitting that like button to support the channel because it really helps out a lot. And hey, if you guys like clothes, hit up the Heavy Spoilers store to pick up some amazing merch. We got some great stuff for you. But like always, you guys have been amazing for watching this video. I love you guys so much, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.